So I don't think it'll come as any surprise that the main threats that we face are from cyber criminals and nation states with malign intent. Over about the last 18 months, the cybersecurity threat to the UK has evolved significantly, but some elements have remained sadly familiar. So firstly, the threat from ransomware is ever present. It's a really big challenge, in fact the biggest challenge, we would say, to businesses and public services throughout the UK. The biggest threat, on the other hand, to citizens and small businesses, I think, comes from cybercrime, with 2.7 million cyber-related frauds perpetrated last year. Internationally, and in terms of state threats, then Russia's brute force invasion of Ukraine brought the potential cyber threat into much sharper focus, as they sought to use disruptive cyber operations to support their military campaign. And looking towards China, what we see is an increasingly sophisticated kind of threat, with the supply chain in particular being a real target. In NCSC, we talk about 4 nation-states being of concern to the UK in cyberspace and posing the most acute threat to the UK and to global cybersecurity. There's a really varied and broad range of threats, from the use of destructive cyber tools such as wiper malware, all the way through to cyber-enabled espionage and the theft of intellectual property. When we're talking about Russia, I think we obviously have been watching really closely the extraordinary conflict in Ukraine in the last year, the illegal invasion of Ukraine and the use of cyber operations within it. What we've not seen is significant impact directly on the UK resulting from that invasion, but Russia continues to be a persistent and active threat to the UK and its interest, which is why the NCSC continues to advise against complacency and asks people to continue to invest in their own resilience. So it's really important that you continue to read our advice and ensure that your cyber defences are as resilient as possible in the face of the kind of thing that Russia is doing in Ukraine. As for China, I think you'll have seen that in this week's Integrated Review refresh, we reaffirmed that China's technical development and evolution is likely to be the single biggest factor affecting the UK's cybersecurity in years to come. China's identified numerous technologies as being vital to its future national security, and they're seeking to achieve dominance in cyberspace, and they've directed significant resources into emerging tech research and development, particularly in advanced artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and semiconductors. Their activities become quite a lot more sophisticated and increasingly targets third-party technology and service supply chains, as well as successfully exploiting software vulnerabilities. And that doesn't show any sign of abating. And in fact, that's partly why we in NCSC work so closely with our UK and international partners, both in the public and private sector. Together, we're doing our best to use the full spectrum of levers to dissect, disrupt, and deter those who do us harm. And we also talk about 2 other nation-states, Iran and DPRK. So Iran remains an aggressive actor with a full range of espionage, disruptive and destructive cyber capabilities, whereas North Korea, I think, focuses their cyber activity more significantly in cyber theft, so for commercial advantage, using its cyber capability to bolster its economic situation through cybercrime. Of course, we take these matters really seriously, but actually many of these threats could impact your organisation in one way or another. But part of what we ask is that everybody takes this seriously, because we see cybersecurity as a whole of society sport, something which everybody needs to play their part in, whether that's as an individual, as a small business, in the supply chain of a larger business, as part of our critical national infrastructure, or indeed part of the public sector more broadly. We disrupt quite a lot of activity, but as the UK government set out, we need to build resilience in order to try and ensure that we are as well defended as possible. So we are grateful to people who are putting in place their own resilience capabilities in their own organisations and their supply chains. We've tried to make that as easy as possible, so we lay out a lot of technical guidance, which we lay out as easy and accessible a language as possible to try and make it as actionable as possible. And you can find that all on the NCSC website, www.ncsc.gov.uk. We've also got engagement teams that help sectors to think through how they can build their own resilience and make sure that guidance is applicable to sectors as a whole. We did that, for example, for farmers in the last couple of years, targeting them at a point at which they were receiving their biggest payments of the year. You can also listen into our flagship conference, Cyber UK, which is being held in Belfast on the 19th and 20th of April this year, for a deeper and better understanding of some of the threats we face. But my one big request is that each of us takes the steps we need to as individuals, as businesses, as organisations, to try and make the UK the safest place to live and work online. companies are quite dependent on both IT and more general supply chains, and criminals unfortunately know that, as do state actors. So what we've seen is that a number of parts of organization supply chains quite vulnerable to compromise. Your software vendors, for example, your managed service providers, your cloud providers. And while we see criminals targeting them for profit, we also see foreign states looking to exploit those for a data or information advantage. I think the point is that sometimes people think about protecting their organization just as walling off the organization that they can see. But in fact, it may well be that the partners you're working with, the procurement you've done, provides an easier entry point for somebody who wants to target your organization, whether that's intentionally targeting you or whether that is accidentally including you in a set of organizations they've compromised by somebody else. And probably the most famous recent instance we saw of this was actually the SolarWinds compromise a couple of years ago in the US. Ransomware is the biggest concern for business in the UK, and in particular it's a concern for large organizations that are potentially a source of profit for cyber criminals. So when we see small organizations being caught by ransomware criminals, it tends to be incidentally or as part of a wider attack, whereas I think larger organizations provide criminals with a way to extract or extort a big enough ransom that it's profitable for them. We've of course seen that the model evolving to becoming ransomware as a service, where different parts of the criminal ecosystem specialize in different parts of whether it's finding the victims, compromising the victims, or offering to help you pay the ransom. But what we do know is that it's really devastating, both in the short and long term. It can take organizations a long time to recover. And if they're not well enough prepared, it can have a really significant immediate impact on a business's ability to operate, or indeed on trust, for example, with your customers or your suppliers. You're compromising data and damaging an organization's reputation, as well as impacting their direct service delivery. So it is quite an evolving model, and it's something we really do ask organizations to think through the scenario of what might happen, what data might you lose, what services might be compromised in a ransomware attack, and plan for that worst case scenario. Understand how it is you can be prepared, and indeed actually how you can see something happening as fast as possible, how your monitoring is good enough, how your defenses are good enough, but also how your recovery is good enough to make you more resilient and more confident in the face of what we know is known threat. We're also seeing an increase in incidents recently where encryption is not as big a feature in the attack, and where ransoms are being demanded to prevent the leaking of sensitive information. And I think that potentially speeds up the business model. So we keep saying to people, this really is one of the things we worry about most if you're a significant sized business. It is the kind of thing that, the kind of steps you can take are steps that will also make you more resilient to a wider range of criminals and state actors. So the UK government's really committed to making the UK the safest place to live and work online. We want to make the UK a really unattractive target for ransomware attacks. We know that cyber criminals are opportunistic, and we know therefore that having defences in place for your organisation reduces your risk of falling victim, or indeed your risk of having a long and difficult recovery period. So what we've done as NCSC is to lay out a set of practical, actionable steps that businesses can take. We don't want businesses to dismiss this as a technical issue. We want boards to take this really seriously as a business risk issue. And indeed, as I've said before, we want businesses to exercise and practice their response to a ransomware attack. We've also done quite a lot of assessment modelling. So we've tried to understand the different possible strains that might affect the UK, how prevalent they are, where they're focused, in order to make sure we can help our law enforcement colleagues to target their resources on the threats that have the biggest impact on UK business. The government's also put in place sanctions against individuals, which are really important, but I would say the business is no substitute for improving your own resilience, which remains right at the heart of the challenge we face. Resilience means, for me, the ability to prepare for, respond to, and recover from cybersecurity incidents, whether that's data breaches, cyber attacks, or other cyber threats. It's a really important feature of the integrated review refresh that's just been published this week. Cyber resilience, I think, is about a comprehensive approach to managing risks and maintaining critical operations and services, even when faced by cyber threats and incidents. It requires a combination of measures, whether that's risk assessment, incident response planning, backups, continuous monitoring of your systems and networks. And we work tirelessly to try and improve the UK's resilience, helping to understand the resilience of different sectors and where it is we really need to see see defences being improved, whether that's because they frankly aren't good enough at the moment, or whether that's because it's a sector that's of really critical importance to the UK as a whole. We stopped 2.1 million attacks last year, but I think far too many still get through. And breaches affect everybody from government all the way from business to individuals and smaller organisations. That's often a result of poor practice, lack of awareness, and I think there's a set of really practical, cost-effective steps that people can take to try and make themselves more resilient. But I think it really is the watchword for us in cybersecurity, is that resilience is the thing that will help you defend yourself against any of the threats out there. It doesn't matter whether it's a cyber criminal or a state actor. It's the thing you can do to make yourself safe. And we've seen that in the last year, in Ukraine in particular, where a number of organisations have come under really sustained cyber assault. But as we say, the defender has a vote. It has been possible for organisations to make themselves resilient enough to be able to withstand that kind of cyber onslaught. For me, a whole-of-society approach means that cybersecurity is the responsibility of absolutely everybody, whether that is you and your family, whether that's your small business, whether that's your large organisation, and whether that's whether you're in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, England, whether you're young or old. It's about everybody. It's not something we should be leaving to a bunch of IT specialists who are going to sort this out for it. And I see quite a lot of people hoping somebody else is going to take this problem away and deal with it. But I really think it's something we shouldn't be afraid of. It's something we should all run towards. We can all take steps to improve our own personal cybersecurity. And we're running a cyber-aware campaign that helps people understand what they can do, whether that's safer passwords using 3 random words, whether that's backing up your data, whether that's patching your phone to make sure that it's got the latest software. So there's a lot of stuff we can all do ourselves. And the same kind of thing is true for our businesses and our organizations. We can plan to understand what our vulnerabilities are and what would be the worst thing that could happen to us if we were to experience a cyber breach, and what it is we can do to make that both less likely and lower impact if it happens. So for me, whole of society is about making clear this is not the responsibility of specialists. It's the responsibility of all of us as a country and all of us as individuals. And that's part of what I think helps us to be the safest place to live and work online here in the UK. I think there's a few pretty simple steps that businesses can take. So we'd say exercise your cyber incident response plan. Have a plan and know where it is and what to do with it. One of the scariest moments I've seen is somebody realizing, or somebody describing the realization that their cyber incident response plan was in fact locked into the computer system, which had been compromised by cyber criminals. So have a plan, make sure you know where it is, and make sure you know what it says. The second one I would think would be conducting regular cybersecurity assessments, helping you to identify vulnerabilities and the steps that you need to take to address them. The third one would be having a comprehensive cybersecurity framework, so making sure that you've got policies, procedures, technologies to protect yourself against cyber threats, reviewing it regularly. It's about providing training for employees. I've talked about what we can do as individuals. Individuals are also employees of larger organizations, and helping to increase awareness amongst your employee base of what they can do to improve their own personal cybersecurity, whether that's at work or at home, helps to make you a safer organization. Backing up your important data. So one of the really critical things, and we saw this in particular actually for local governments, is making sure that you've got a secure offline backup of your really key data and that you know what data you hold, which of course is something the Information Commissioner would expect you to know. But it's really important to speed up your recovery if you understand pretty rapidly the kind of data that you hold and what you might have lost. And indeed that you're able to back it up effectively. We ask people to use strong passwords and multi-factor authentication. So as I said before, 3 random words for passwords, and 2-step verification, which I think has become a bit of a subject of conversation recently with Twitter's move to move away from using phones as a second backup, but actually to using alternate means. And there are options. We've written a blog on that recently. And we'd like businesses to enforce those kind of strong password policies and encourage the use of 2-step verification, but also think about what they're asking of their customers, for example, if they're online businesses. And finally, we'd ask people to monitor their systems for suspicious activity. So make sure you've got systems in place. That means you've got logs, and you understand what's happened if you begin to see something suspicious. That's what I think really helps to make us safer online.